Our next speaker is Anita Kellogg from the Department of Political Science, and her talk is entitled The Commercial Peace, Linking Business to International Security.
In the mid-1980s, a dispute over a maritime border in the Gulf of Venezuela became a source of conflict between Colombia and Venezuela. In August 1987, a Colombian warship crossed the border with the goal of expelling Venezuelan fishing boats from the disputed waters. Venezuela responded by sending several of its own naval vessels to defend its claim on the territory. Once that happened, Colombia sent in a few more warships, causing the conflict to escalate. In fact, relations between the two nations became so strained that the Organization of American States stepped in to prevent the crisis from erupting into a full-scale war. Only after negotiations did the two countries back down. Then, in the mid-1990s, these two countries were once again at odds, when Venezuela demanded that they be able to cross over into Colombia to go after drug traffickers. However, this time, instead of opting for military force, the dispute was successfully addressed through each of the countries' diplomatic channels. But why were these two conflicts, just 10 years apart, met so differently? One with military force, the other through peaceful diplomacy and cooperation. As a political scientist in the field of international relations, I wanted to know if economic interdependence creates incentives for governments to choose diplomacy over military force. One of the ways international relations scholars have addressed questions of war and peace is by identifying national characteristics such as military power and economic resources that affect the probability of militarized studies. Within this field, multiple studies looking at interstate relations across the world since 1950 have shown that increasing economic interdependence does reduce the odds of military conflict. But what these studies can't explain is how economic interdependence is linked to the use of military force. After all, it isn't obvious that state leaders consider the economic costs and benefits of their national security decisions. After all, it is private business, not the government, who benefits from trade and suffers losses when it's disrupted. So I got to thinking, if business is the group most harmed by militarized conflict between economically interdependent countries, could it be possible that business has the ability to influence national security decisions? In the case of Colombia, absolutely. Returning to the Colombia-Venezuela rivalries, the two countries were once again at odds in 2004. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez suspended all cross-border trade after an accused Colombian rebel leader was captured on Venezuelan territory and brought to Colombia and incarcerated. Wanting a quick resolve to the dispute, Colombian business leaders pressured their own government. Within 2 weeks, the Colombian president gave an official apology for the incident and trade was restored. But business did not have the same level of influence in Venezuela. Just a year before, in 2003, Chavez had fired 20,000 employees at the state-run oil company. The reason? It was not because they were ineffective. It was because they were accused of not being loyal to Chavez. This mass firing, along with Chavez's autocratic control over Venezuela, excluded business from government policymaking. This freed Chavez to make political decisions that harmed Venezuela's economy, such as stopping trade with Colombia, without fear of protest or removal from office. While business was involved in national security policy in Colombia, it was not in Venezuela, which made me wonder, what makes business influential in policymaking in some countries, but not others? So I selected 25 of the most economically interdependent rivalries in order to try to identify the circumstances that determine when business is influential and when it's not. I chose to conduct case studies of rivalries from 1870 through the present, with at least 2 studies from nearly every region of the globe. What I discovered is that business's influence does not come down to a simple democratic versus authoritarian divide. In fact, in many autocratic governments, the business community is surprisingly influential. For instance, a terrific example is China. From 2010 through 2014, tensions rose between China and Japan over a small group of uninhabited islands in the East Sea. Experts in the region feared that the 2 countries were headed towards a military showdown that could trigger a full-fledged war. The way the conflict was avoided, however, took place at the negotiating table, when business and Chinese provincial leaders, most dependent on Japanese trade, successfully lobbied their own government for de-escalation. Not only did China and Japan sign an agreement over the islands, but trade between the 2 countries increased for the first time in 3 years. What the China-Japan story illustrates is that it is necessary for business to have established means of influence in other areas of government policymaking. For example, there are many ways firms and business associations approach politics. They can lobby decision makers. They can choose to invest in political campaigns and can play a significant role in the selection of candidates. Additionally, prominent business leaders may be appointed to key roles within the government. These partnerships between commercial interests and government provide a way for business to influence national security decisions. So how can these results be applied to meet goals of international security and prosperity? To begin with, in order to create incentives to choose diplomacy over military force, the United States and the international community should focus both on increasing economic interdependence and strengthening businesses' role in government policymaking. My research also explains why China's growing economic and political power does not automatically mean that it is a security threat to the United States. Our economic ties and the importance of the business community to both governments creates incentives for both countries to choose peace over military confrontation. On the other hand, countries with authoritarian governments whose economies are dependent on oil tend to exclude business from policymaking. This doesn't necessarily mean they are more likely to start wars, but it is harder to deter them from using military force. So what does this all mean in terms of reducing interstate militarized conflict and strengthening the bonds of peace? There is a perception that militarized conflict between nations is inevitable. Many citizens put their trust in government leaders and military commanders to keep the nation secure. While nations will continue to have disputes, I believe that commercial interests can provide incentives for choosing to resolve these differences through diplomacy rather than military force. As individuals, our actions, going to our places of employment, participating in the economy, seem to have little impact on the forces of international security. Even CEOs and company presidents have little power on their own. However, what I found through my research is that business as a community can significantly alter the incentives for war and peace. So if greater peace is truly our goal, perhaps we should focus our efforts on making sure that business has a role in government policymaking across the globe.